Okay, so I have sponge cake, which is a foam cake on this side. Look how nice and tall those are. They've got a lot of height to them. And on the other side, I have butter cake. It's just a vanilla cake. It's a shortened cake. And I want you to see them side by side. You see the height difference? The sponge cake is definitely taller than the shortened cake. Which one do you think is going to be heavier? We can see a height difference. Is there going to be a weight difference? Thoughts? Anybody? We're not going to guess? Well, I'm going to go ahead and weigh them. We're going to find out. So let me turn on my scale. And I have it set for pounds and ounces. First, I'm going to weigh this sponge cake. It's the taller one, the bigger one. It weighs 6.1 ounces. And then I'm going to weigh our butter cake, the shorter one, smaller one, 7.3 ounces. There are 1.2 ounces difference. This shorter, smaller cake is heavier. That tells us that our butter cake is definitely denser than our sponge cake. There's a lot more volume to the foam cake, to the sponge cake, and that's from all those whipped eggs that I used. When I made these cakes, each batter made an equal number of cakes, but I used 3 eggs in our butter cakes, and when I made the same quantity of cake with another batter for the foam cake, this took 8 eggs. I whipped those eggs for 15 minutes on high speed in my mixer. My mixer motor was getting a little warm from all of that work, and it was such a volume that it almost filled the bowl. And then I very gently folded in the flour, the baking powder. No baking powder, just the flour, and then a little bit of melted butter. So just sheer volume, there's a ton of air, which makes this a lighter cake in weight. So that was our first 2 observations. One is taller, one is heavier. Our next observation is, what do they look like on the inside? So I'm going to cut a sponge cake in half, and I will tell you that a bread knife is always going to do a better job of cutting a sponge cake because that serrated edge is going to cut nicely through the cake. It's almost like cutting bread. It has a different structure to it than our butter cake. So if you try to press a regular knife down through a sponge cake, you're going to end up making a mess. It's just going to compress it down. It's not going to cut it nicely. You need a bread knife for that. So this is our sponge cake. Tons and tons of little air bubbles in there. And then this is our butter cake. There are air bubbles, not as many. Some of them are bigger. But the sheer number of air bubbles is what makes the sponge cake lighter, fluffier, and taller than our butter cake. So that was the inside of the cake, what it looks like. Now we have 2 other things that we want to do with our cakes. I'm going to move the little ones out of the way. We're going to use those for soaking. The next thing I want to show you is that when you compress these cakes, different things happen. When you compress them, meaning you just press down, I'm going to do that right now. One of them is definitely going to stick to me. You'll see which one. So I'm just going to press down, and when I lift back up, you can tell that this is the one that stuck. It's all over my hand. But this one came back up, and it's not falling apart. It still has, it bounced back from that pressure, and it's not breaking apart. This one did not respond, did not completely come back to shape, and it's very easily breaking apart. So we broke some of the crumb of this cake by doing that. So that tells us the texture on the inside is different. This one has a lot more structure to it from all of those egg whites. We're talking about a ton of protein. So all of those egg whites created this really awesome structure. And because we have very little gluten development and very little protein from egg, we have less structure here. So this one is softer and easier to chew. It has that softer crumb that we're used to from our birthday cakes. This one takes a lot more, I mean, you can see it takes some pressure to break it in half. And because of that structure, you're going to, it's a little chewier in texture. So it's not honestly my favorite texture. Now, one last thing that we're going to do, move all these cakes out of the way. This one is the most fun. So I want you to see how well they absorb liquid. Sometimes we try to soak our cakes with things. We soak them with different flavored liquids. I make a coconut cake for the holidays, and I always you make a cake soak in that cake, and I make it with coconut milk and sugar. I cook them together till the sugar dissolves, and then when the cake comes out of the oven, I soak that into the cake. One of these cakes absorbs much better than the other. So I've mixed up some Jell-O. I have Jolly Rancher Blue Raspberry Jell-O because it makes a beautiful blue Jell-O solution. It's still liquid. I didn't refrigerate it. I just made it while you guys were working on your other assignment. So I'm going to use this liquid and see how well it absorbs into the cakes. But first, I'm going to wash my hands. Okay, so I have all of the cake off my hands, and we're going to start with let's start with the sponge cake. When I pour this over it, it immediately disappeared down into the cake. Even when I pour it around the edge, it doesn't just run down to the center, it absorbs around the edge as well. It's like the cake is sucking it down into the cake itself. It disappears right away. I just stand here and watch this happen till my cake is full, I think. So it very readily absorbs liquid. Now, our butter cake, do you see this? We have a puddle over here on the side. When I pour the Jell-O on there, it runs right off the top. It doesn't go into the cake really at all. I'm just making a puddle of Jell-O beside it. You see there's no puddle around this one, and it's just Jell-O everywhere over here. So our sponge cake absorbs liquid much better than a butter cake. So if you're going to be soaking your cake, or you want to have a flavor of some sort with a cake soak, you're going to want a sponge cake if you want it to really just grab a hold of all of that liquid. Now, one thing that we have discovered is that if you want liquid to soak into this butter cake, you need to make some holes. So I just use a skewer here. I'm just going to poke some holes. And if you've ever heard of a poke cake or seen a poke cake, they were very, very popular when I was younger, I think in like the 80s. Yeah, it was that long ago, really. You poke holes all through the cake, and then you pour the liquid over it. And it absorbs down into the holes. Wow. It's called a poke cake, and when usually these are served with like a Cool Whip topping or a whipped cream topping on them. And you can use any kind of flavor that you want to, any flavor Jell-O. But when you cut these open, you find little streaks of the color of the liquid down into the cake where you poked those holes with your skewer. So I'm going to cut these open again, these ones that we soaked. I want you to see just how well this absorbed. It absorbed it clear down through to the very bottom of the cake. It sucked it in like a sponge, which is how it gets its name. It is a sponge cake because it acts like a sponge. I can even press some of that liquid back out, and my cake maintains some shape. Now, this one, you see, it still, even with the holes in it, it still did not go down the whole way through the cake. It went some distance in places where those holes were poked, but it did not absorb in any of the rest of the cake area. So it's still, even with the holes in it, still does not absorb very well. Mama. I'm sorry, Trey. I'll be with you in a moment. Let me finish this, please. Okay, So now we know that our foam cake is lighter in weight. It is usually taller in height. It's lighter in texture, but it is a little bit chewier because of all of the structure that is produced. So if you want a really soft, crumbly, not really crumbly, but a soft, moist cake, you're going to go for a butter cake. If you want a cake that has a little more structure to it, can stand up to a little bit more liquid and weight, you want a foam cake. You also have learned we learned the weight difference, we learned the size, we learned the texture on the inside, and we also learned how they soak up liquid. I think we've learned quite a bit about cakes today. You also saw in the videos earlier in this lesson how these cakes are made, so you really should be now able to make a really informed choice whether you need a butter cake or a sponge cake for the cake celebration of your choosing.